we pause recording and we say, hey man, we love this. And usually the conversation is vibing. Conversation is vibing. They're loving it. We're loving it. And we say, let's just stand for another 20, 30 minutes, crank this out, and we're going to split this into 2 episodes. Done.
Most hosts never achieve the results they hoped for. They're falling short on listenership and monetization, meaning their message isn't being heard and their show ends up costing them money. This podcast was created to help you grow your listenership and make money while you're at it. Get ready to take notes. Here's your host, Adam Adams.
And we're back with another episode of Podcast on Podcasting. Hey, podcasters, it's Adam Adams, and we're taking a quick break from the podcast content just to read a written review that came into the podcast. This one's from Cityside Capital. And so first and foremost, I want to thank you, Cityside Capital, for just taking the time to leave an honest review. Happened to be 5-star, and I'm grateful for that as well. It says true value. The value that Adam provides is unmatched, all in caps with lots of exclamation marks. Unmatched, he says, or he or she says. I don't know. Cityside Capital could also be female. I don't mean to be genderist. But then Cityside Capital says, I appreciate the willingness to share the tips and tricks that make a podcast go. Thank you. Well, Cityside Capital, you just got 1 entry into our free giveaway. So we do, anytime you give a written rating or review, if it's an honest review, you get 1 automatic entry, and we spin this about once a month in order to find who we're going to gift one of our amazing packages. Cityside Capital, you just got 1 entry into that. And if you want 5 more entries, all you got to do now is say, hey, Adam, I heard my episode on the podcast. Take a little screenshot of your written review, and email it to team@growyourshow.com. And we will not just give you the 1 that you already have, but 5 more entries to winning 6 months of one of our free services, either to launch your podcast or to edit and publish and produce all the back end stuff for your podcast, or to market your podcast. You could win one of those packages, and you'll have a higher chance once you take a screenshot of this. Thank you, Cityside Capital. We appreciate you just as much as you appreciate us, maybe even more. And let's jump into the content. And we've got a guest on the show today. His name is Kevin Brenner. Kevin, what's going on, man?
Hey, Adam, what's going on, man? Thanks for having me.
Hanging out. One thing that I like about kind of what you're doing, your podcast is called Active Duty Passive Income. You became part of that podcast after it started, which is really neat. You became co-partner and co-host, and now you're basically just the host. Is that right?
Yeah. So it started out, really, Active Duty Passive Income is exactly what it sounds like. It's an education company, and we are an education company, and we focus on military. So I was active duty Air Force. I'm technically, at time of recording, I have about a month left of active duty service. But the podcast that was launched about 8 to 9 months before I came on board. And as that company was growing, I got integrated into it. And I found myself in a position where it was like, hey, I can help out with this and help get it more organized and repeatable and clean up the processes. And by doing that, landed myself a spot as a co-host.
So when you say that you wanted to be part of it because you knew that you could clean up some processes, what does that mean? Because I know that can be helpful for a listener who's starting a podcast or maybe taking over a podcast.
Yeah. I mean, you can see podcasts. And so to give you an idea, at the time when I started, we were doing editing through Audacity. The host was editing through Audacity, and it would take us approximately 4 hours to edit a 50-minute episode, which obviously is insane, right? We didn't have any help. We didn't have nothing going on, no budget, no anything, right? And then also the audio quality was pretty bad because we weren't using cardioid mics. We were using like just old, cheap kind of like Amazon $19 microphones, and it sounded like everyone was in a tin can, and we didn't know at the time. So by cleaning up not only the process of how do we acquire guests and doing that, I was able to prove to the company that I had value. And then that kind of launched me into a position to say, hey, I want to keep working with y'all, but I want to be a co-host of this podcast, and here are the reasons why. And for me, it was about branding, self-branding, promoting my brand as a real estate investor, mentor, coach, educator, all of that stuff, but also to build credibility with an audience of potential investors that I knew I was going to take into my next venture.
So one thing that I heard you mention is that you switched the microphone. So you went from one kind of microphone. I assume it was a condenser mic, and then now you're using a cardioid dynamic mic, which really just picks up the sound right next to you. We mention this all the time on the podcast because a lot of people make that mistake. Do you remember what that mic was that you got?
Oh, dude. Yeah,
Was
I
it
remember
the
what it was. No.
Was it the Blue Yeti?
No. Oh, God. Did they make I'm sure they do, a condenser mic, like Blue Yeti?
Yeah, that's the
that you like spend
one.
a lot of money on, and then it's like doesn't work too well. Well, not for
like
what you're doing.
$120 or something.
No. This was like a $19 Amazon. I don't know. It was like a fake it mic. Like it looked cool, but it didn't function. But the whole thing is, we didn't know what we didn't know. We're like, hey, we're on a budget, $20. Boom, let's go.
Yeah.
So yeah,
100% makes sense. And I think a lot of people make that mistake. What other systemization, automation, repeatable processes, as you were stating before, what other things did you do to kind of come in and make it easier to host the podcast?
Yeah. So, I mean, God, where to start? So first thing we did was we looked at, okay, what is the process, right? Because everything is a system, everything is a process. If you want to make your life easier, start with a process. So we, at the time, had just picked up company-wide using a project management tool called ClickUp. And I actually freaking love this tool. It's like Asana and Monday, but on steroids. It's tremendously better. But be that as it may, we used this tool and we were able to integrate it with Zapier and Calendly. So we set up these systems so that, for example, when someone booked a call on our Calendly link, right? Like they booked a podcast interview, then an automation was sent to ClickUp and a task was created that says, hey, you have a call with Adam on this date and whatever. And we could click in that task and all of the notes, everything we wanted to talk about with Adam, a templated thing was created. Boom. Okay. So we have that now. And then we started.
Wait, can I interrupt you?
Oh yeah, sure.
What do you mean it automatically is created? I'm trying to put myself into your shoes and I'm going to use ClickUp or whatever.
Right.
And Calendly comes in and through Zapier and ClickUp, once that's booked, it propagates something into my calendar and it tells me all of these things. One of the things that I heard though was inside of that, it shows automatically everything that you wanted to talk about with a certain guest. Is that because it like comes up with it, or do you personally need to add that to it? How does that part work?
So yeah, no, that's a great question. So what we did was we built a templated task. So we told ClickUp, when someone books a call through Calendly, I want you to create this task. And every time you create this type of task, which was tagged podcast interview, it's going to have this template. And the template was our show notes. So the template was the title and everything that we would post in the bottom of the podcast is our show notes. And then we, in the beginning, were doing it, but then we had a VA come in. So the VA would create the show notes for us after listening to the episode in post-production during the editing phase. So they have a one-stop shop to create the show notes. In that task, you can also add images. So all of our marketing materials and our images. And that's a whole nother thing, that a system that I set up, because in Calendly, right, we're collecting bios, we're collecting headshots. And then from there, we would store the raw bio and headshot in the ClickUp task. And then we would transfer that stuff over to Canva and create custom images, audiograms, all of this stuff. It didn't all happen overnight. Like we started with one marketing image that we would give to someone. But the idea of giving this marketing image was, hey, this helps promote the show, because that person is going to want to go and share it on their social, hopefully. And sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But point being, it's a tool, right? So all of these kind of integrations came together to help us optimize the system. And we're constantly changing this and kind of making minor tweaks as we go along. And one of those minor tweaks, and this is a great tip for your podcasters or your folks who are listening that are podcasting, we set up a call, a pre-interview call, because we would get people from our community that we would cultivate. Hey, you're a military real estate investor, come on the podcast. And we would set them up with everything. And they'd book the interview and we're ready to interview. They're there, we're there, let's go. And there just happen to be some people just aren't good communicators. Like they're not good on podcasts, but they might have a fantastic story. But as a host, you're like kind of pulling the information out of them. And after like 3 of those interviews, like we couldn't actually even use the interview. It was like really just, unfortunately, just bad, whether it was bad audio quality or just storytelling or just not engaging, not entertaining, not educational. So what we did was Then we set up a pre-interview. So everyone who wanted to apply to be on our podcast had to go through the pre-interview phase. Same system set up. They book the pre-interview through Calendly. It goes to ClickUp, creates the task for us and the VA. And then it has a different template. So that template pretty much says what questions we work. It's a 15-minute call on this pre-interview call just via Zoom. And we talk with the person and say, hey, how do you want to design your episode? What would be your ideal title for your episode? What questions do you want to talk about? What topics do you want to hit? Are you promoting anything? We kind of sort all this out and design the perfect episode. Then at the end of that, we send them the actual booking link, assuming that they're good. And then they book. That information that we made in that task automatically transferred. So when we're booking and we pull up this person, if I'm interviewing Adam right now or you're interviewing me, all the stuff instantly pops up and we're like, oh yeah, that's what I was going to talk about with Adam. I was going to talk about this, that, and the other. So the systems make life so much easier, but they require tweaking and management.
With the 15-minute pre-interview call that it's booked on Calendly, goes to ClickUp, you get the task, you use a template, you ask certain questions like, how do you want to design the episode? What topics do you want to cover? And are you going to promote anything? When you're doing that, do you feel like it's a waste of time? Do you feel like it takes too much out of your day? And there's a couple reasons why I say it, and really want to hear your thoughts on it. One of the reasons is because depending on how many interviews we do and pre-interviews we do, sometimes we could forget some of those things. Now, I understand you've got a template and you're taking notes, right? Then I'm also wondering, like with my podcast, this podcast, for example, we do the pre-interview while we're going. We do Q&A and it's all one shot, one time. I don't remember where I heard this, but some famous person said, you only want to touch things one time. Mm-hmm. Like, as soon as you grab something, instead of organizing it and filing it and trying to figure out when to do it, just get it out of the way. Just get it done, touch it one time. And that ended up helping people to be more time efficient. And so for me, I guess I took that to heart. With my pre-interviews, I do it in the beginning of the actual interview. I ask most of the same questions that you do. We try to figure out a topic, etc. What are your thoughts for like a new podcaster? Should they get on 2 separate calls with everybody or just the one call, and why?
Yeah, I think when you're just starting out, just stick with one call, because it's all about, in the beginning, assuming you don't have a massive audience or some sort of cultivated audience and you're just podcasting on some topic. In the beginning, you're in charge of sourcing your own guests. If it's an interview style show, you're in charge of that, which makes sense. And you might lose guests because of the process might not be like sussed out completely, like just optimized yet. So in the beginning, when you're just starting, I would say just do one interview and do what Adam, do what you do and just ask some pre-interview questions and then record it and thank you very much and get it all done in one go. The reason we set ours up this way is because we have a cultivated audience of 30,000 member Facebook group, and some people that come outside the Facebook group, and now we have like the interview valet people trying to like get their people on our show and all of that stuff. But that didn't happen in the beginning. We were just reaching out to people we thought were influential and said, hey, let me do a value add for you. I'd love to record your story and just put it on the airwaves. And that's all you have to do.
I like how you say that, by the way, Kevin. Like, I want to do a value add for you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And they're influential because like the listener who's a podcaster or about to be a podcaster, they probably are thinking, oh, that person would be doing me such a favor if they came on my podcast. But it's a little bit different. Like you pitch it such as, let me add value to you. Let me give you more exposure. Let me allow you to share your story with our audience. The way that you're wording it changes the dynamic of that relationship between you and the guest. Instead of the guest being like, I've got to be on Adam's podcast. It's like, oh, that's awesome. Adam or Kevin is helping me to kind of get my story out. And so I think that was a huge takeaway. There's a bunch of other things that you've mentioned already. And I know I've got a lot of questions, but I would like to touch on a few of these things. we're going to put ClickUp in the show notes. So for the listener, if you're curious about that, it's already in the show notes. Zapier as well, already in the show notes. Calendly as well, already in the show notes. Kevin also mentioned something called Canva briefly, where he'll take that bio and the headshot, and then he'll create image cards and quote cards and things like that. Canva allows you, if you don't have a whole bunch of experience with it's like
a Photoshop, not Photoshop, Illustrator, Adobe Illustrator.
Any of that. Yeah. So if you're not like really good at creating all of these promotional material on your own, you're not a designer, Canva kind of solves that problem for you. So all of those links are in the show notes. The raw bio and headshots you mentioned and the show notes. I'm curious about this just to brief on. You mentioned that with your process, you get a lot of those pieces of information in a templated area to make it easier on yourself or a virtual assistant to be able to complete the show notes. What I'm a little curious of is with many podcast episodes, I only assume that you might want to take it off of the direction that you originally expected or that your guest wanted to promote. You might end up diving a little bit more deeply into a couple of pieces of it, making possibly the episode about something a little bit different. If or when that happens, how do you write the show notes then? What kind of changes there?
Yeah, I mean, it's the template of the show notes. So we have the pre-interview call, right? And we put in, hey, and I actually have one pulled up here, but it doesn't matter. We say, what's the general area? And then throughout the show, if we get into a topic and we like, oh my God, 35, 45 minutes has gone on, we've just been nailing this topic. We have two choices. One, we say, hey, and we've done this before. Hey, John, the guest or whatever, we had a great interview. We really dove in on something, and I think our audience is totally going to love it. How about you come on again for a follow-up episode where we talk about this, that, and the other? And then what we do is we pause recording and we say, hey, man, we love this. And usually the conversation is vibing, right? Conversation is vibing. They're loving it. We're loving it. And we say, let's just stay on for another like 20, 30 minutes, crank this out, and we're going to split this into 2 episodes. Boom, done. And as far as the creating of the show notes, that gets done in post-production. So that gets done after the episode is, well, it's really during the editing process. And our folks, our editors, are going in and putting pieces of information. And also, by the way, ClickUp is awesome because you can build a checklist in there that checks off everything the VA has to do in that thing as far as the entire podcast production. But things that are in our show notes, 5 key takeaways. So when they're listening, they're saying, okay, well, that could be a key takeaway. So they type that up. And then honorable mentions and links. Oh, hey, just like you just said. Oh, all the links to the software that we're talking about, we're going to throw that in. There's social media links, which they get mostly from Calendly and they can source by themselves. And then part of the template is actually advertisements and sponsorships that we build into these show notes, affiliate marketing and sponsorships. And then we have like kind of a helpful resources. And then we ask people, this is all templated, helpful resources with links. And then the last bit of the template is write us a review kind of a thing. And yeah, it's just the show notes thing pretty much is just a big quote, 5 key takeaways, honorable mentions, and how to connect with that guest. And then the rest is templated. So that all gets done during the editing process, specifically the 5 key takeaways.
I'm making some notes and I want to make sure if I've got this correctly. With the template that you send to your virtual assistant, there's a few things that the VA needs to do as they're writing your show notes. One of them is that they look for those 5 key takeaways. Well, another one is that they find resources that were mentioned, like websites and things like that. Another one was any ads or sponsorship or affiliate relationships that you have either with that guest on the show or potentially your own products or services, or potentially if you have an advertiser. So they'll also put those in there as well. Another thing that I think I heard was how to connect with the guest. So you basically give like their social media, maybe their website, things like that. or some type of lead magnet, perhaps.
Yep.
And so I got those 4. I heard write us a review. If you could tell me more about what that means. And I think I missed one.
No, I think you got them all. There was a helpful resources, which is just more backlinks to our website and stuff.
Okay.
And then it's the please subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts. And it's just a little blurb. Hey, if you like this show, if the information I shared in this weekly interview is pursued your dreams, but it's copywriting. And then it says, please write us a review. And yeah, that's just.
Oh, okay. So in the show notes, one of the things that you put in the show notes is to the listener. So as they're writing it, not only are they hearing that they should write a review or leave a rating and a review on the podcast.
It's in the show notes.
But it's also written down in the show notes.
Exactly.
That's cool.
Yeah, I know this may be a video podcast or it might go on YouTube or something, but that might take away from the actual show, the listener part, but you let me know.
So one of the things, Kevin, that you've mentioned throughout our interview today, you mention a lot about this virtual assistant. And I believe that in the beginning, like your own team was doing all this in-house personally, like maybe Mike was editing or something like that. And you kind of have progressed toward having a virtual assistant. What tips would you have for our other podcasters? Like, should they be doing it on their own? Should they start on their own? Should they go straight to the VA? Should they work with a company like mine who handles everything and you don't have to worry about like hiring or training a VA? And whichever way you think that the listener should go, do you have a couple of tips in order to be better at that?
Yeah, I think it comes down to your time and how you value your time, right? Because you can spend as long as you want recording a podcast, editing a podcast. You can go down and make it the most perfectly edited podcast, but if no one listens to it, then, it doesn't really matter. So it's kind of like a multifaceted approach that it's not just the editing. It's not just the sound quality. It's not just the content. It's not just the marketing. All of that stuff kind of comes together. So if you kind of consider yourself like at the helm of this podcast, and I'm kind of referring to your listeners who are podcasting right now, you're going to need some help along the way. And that help doesn't necessarily have to come in the form of a human being, a virtual assistant. We started out, and one of the first things we did was we moved as far away from Audacity for editing as we could. And we found Alitu. And Alitu is an amazing software platform that allows us to edit things much, much, much quicker.
Will you spell Alitu so I can get it into the show notes?
It's Alitu. And it's awesome. I really do like it. And it just makes our editing. So in the beginning of the show, I think I mentioned it was like 4 hours to do a 50-minute episode with Audacity. We have that down to like 15-ish minutes to do that 50-minute episode in Alitu, just because it has algorithms and AI that takes out all the uhs and ums, and like it does a pretty good job. You kind of have to steer the ship a little bit, but it's way faster. So like that was our first thing, and before getting a VA on board. And then as we started kind of growing and working more with sponsors and this and stuff, we wanted to direct our time elsewhere. Instead of editing, we're like, hey, we need to direct our time towards marketing. Okay, well, let's make graphics on Canva. Let's make audiograms on Headliner, and let's put that out because that's going to get us more listens and more downloads. And then more downloads, that means that you have more opportunity to monetize through sponsorships because people want growth, reach, and downloads, right? So we kind of worked on that. And that was around the point where we're like, okay, well, if we're going to do that, focus on the marketing bit, then I need help with the editing bit. And we had a VA in the company already. So we kind of just gave her some additional roles. But my point is that you can't do everything all the time. And I think that's a common misconception among not just podcasters, but I consider a podcaster to be a CEO of the podcast. It's kind of like a CEO thing. Like you want to have your hands in every pot, but you just can't. And otherwise, because the more you grow your company or your podcast or whatever, the more you realize that your interference is actually slowing it down. You think you're doing someone a favor, you're actually slowing them down. So that's just kind of a business lesson, and I think applies great to podcasting.
Well, and it also resonates with me because I know that's me as well. I'm always trying to micromanage everything, and it just slows it down. It stresses people out. I'm stressed out. And if I just stay out of it, it'll get done well. It'll be good enough. And same thing like with the podcast. We need to find out what it is we want to be in charge of. You mentioned like you wanted to really focus more on the marketing, and to be able to allow you to do the marketing and the growth of the podcast, you needed a little bit of help. And I love that. I think that it's something that should probably resonate with most people that listen, because many of us are more of that CEO type personality, like more of a type A, more of a, I can get this done, etc. So I really see that landing well, a lot of people's ears. So Alitu, that's in the show notes. I'll also make sure Headliner is in the resource section of our show notes so that the listener can go there and check out different audiograms, how you're doing it. And another couple things before I just let you go is just, what was your big why behind being part of the podcast? Why you wanted to be a podcaster? And has any of those desires come to fruition for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I knew I always wanted to be on a podcast. And I had kind of back in the day, like kicked around the idea, I'm just going to start my own podcast. And then I got involved with Active Duty Passive Income, the company, and I started adding a bunch of value normally as a member. Fast forward 6 months to a year later, CEO calls me and says, hey man, you just want to work for us? And I was like, yeah, let's do that. And part of that was I had always wanted to be on the podcast. Still, I had that dream. And I was like, well, part of this is I want to co-host the podcast. And I didn't just say, I want to co-host the podcast because I want to be on a podcast. I said, I want to co-host the podcast because I think I can add tremendous value as a co-host, not just because of my personality and blah, 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 but also I said, I'm going to optimize things because I can see how it's not as optimized as it could be. And they were like, oh, heck yeah, because what was their problem? They were focusing on building the rest of the company, and the podcast was just, it wasn't necessarily a priority. So to have someone come in and optimize things, let's do it. So kind of shaping that win-win. But for me, the podcast, one of the things that it offered me was credibility. Credibility in the space. It's unbelievable. So if you think of like people in America, right? 335-ish million people, right? How many podcasters are there, Adam? A lot.
2.2 million.
2.2 million? Okay. 2.2 million worldwide. So let's say there's 1 million podcasters in the US.
Okay.
Math in public, that's like a 0.3%. So most people, my point is most people aren't podcasting. And they think that someone who has a podcast, it's like you're Larry King. It's like you're one of the greatest interviewers on planet. It's just that credibility. It's almost as if you're an author of a book, or you just kind of rise yourself up a level. And if you think strategically about how that credibility can help you and you use that to your advantage, you can build business relationships. And that's what that has enabled me to do. I was podcasting and I was on the airwaves, and I was not only every time I make a social post about the next podcast, but that is more credibility. Hey, look at this professional looking show that this guy runs. Or, hey, there's all these reviews on it, or blah, blah, blah. Listeners, who cares? That gave me clout. And then I used that and I had prospective business partners and people offering me deals and just wanting to network because they saw the power of the show. And they were like, hey, let's do some deals. Let's do some business. And I ended up finding one of my business partners for my private equity firm from the podcast. He said, I didn't know who the heck you were. I did some research on you. I found you. I Googled your name and you came up as a host of a podcast. I listened to a couple episodes. And I was like, oh my God, this guy is like legit. And he reached out, and that's what happened. But I didn't know any of this was happening, obviously.
Yeah.
But that's the power of it, because if that could have went completely wrong, if I just, he Googled my name and nothing came up and it was like, screw this guy.
I agree 100%. That's a compelling reason to start a podcast. I love the takeaways that you gave us about like how to create show notes, all the parts that you use in your business. I like also those questions that the way that you made it more of a process for this pre-interview, or what did you call it?
We call it a guest intro call.
A guest intro call. Yeah. And also talked about some of the questions that you ask and like how you think around getting out that content, how you're taking notes, how you're utilizing some of these, ClickUp, Zapier, Calendly, Canva, headliner, Alitu.
So many.
In order to kind of like make your life a little bit easier. Also talking about your virtual assistant, how you're able to kind of get somebody who already worked for the company to take over a few of those tasks so that you could really stay in your lane as the CEO of the podcast. I want to just end with one thing. By the way, your website and your podcast link are already in the show notes. I want you to just pour into a brand new podcaster who's, let's say, about to get started, wanting to get started. What quick tips would really move the needle for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously, if you want to get started, you have to get clear on your message. Not only what your message is, but who your message is for. And it goes for any type of business, really. But if you consider podcasting as a kind of voice box or a speaker for your business, you need to be really clear on who you are speaking to. Because once you find out who your ideal client is, or whether they're clients or not, or whoever's listening, your ideal listener, then you can go and cater the guest. If you're doing an interview style show, you can cater the guest to that listener. Who is that listener going to want to hear from? At Active Duty Passive Income, we're a military real estate investing education company. We bring on military real estate investors, folks, active duty and veterans, wildly successful in real estate. And then also we'll bring on some of our students. And it's a great way to get our students that credibility booster and keep them in the program, because we'll say something like, hey, we'd love that you just closed that deal. You're one of our students already. I'd love to do a member spotlight episode on you and spotlight you in front of our entire audience. What is that going to do for them? That's going to give them more deals. It's going to make them a super fan, not only of the company, but of the show. So you got to think strategically. That's what I'm kind of boiling it down to, is know your message, know your client, know your strategy, and then just take action. Because I got news for you. You're going to suck when you get started. You are going to suck, and no one's going to listen to your show. And it's all about consistency, consistency, consistency. Keep the schedule. Keep consistent. I guarantee you, eventually it'll pick up. You will have listeners. As long as you have those tips in mind and you're not just all over the place. It's going to be a rough go in the beginning, but don't let that bring you down. And you're going to get better as an interviewer and as a podcast host and as the CEO of the podcast. You're going to get better, but you have to take action. You have to practice, because most people wouldn't even take action. Only the 1%, like we talked about, or 0.3% of folks out there are actually doing this. So go and do it.
Kevin, I appreciate you jumping on the show. And for the listener, scroll down, click on any of those links that are going to support you and get you to the next level. For your advice that you wrapped up with, Kevin, that you really want to understand the avatar and you want to speak to them and have the right guests on. I know that's a mistake that many people have made who have started podcasts. They don't understand who their avatar is. They don't understand, like, they think, I want to invite this person because I would like to have a conversation with them. Mm-hmm. But they don't really think, like, how does this support my perfect listener, the person I want listening to the show? How does it pour into them? And one of the examples, because you're in real estate and you're raising money through your private equity fund, is that people have people that are just starting to do this business and getting their first couple of deals and operating deals. And they're asking questions like, how did you call the broker? What did you say to the broker? Mm-hmm. But maybe that person wants to raise just passive equity into the deals. And none of those questions really support that listener. It just makes for a good conversation one-on-one, but it's not really having that strategy like you had mentioned. So really powerful. Appreciate you. And let's jump off and we'll see you soon. Bye.
All right. Thanks, Adam.
2 quick things before you go. Number 1, if you are looking to upgrade like your podcast equipment or just get your very first affordable microphone, then go to growyourshow.com/PDF. That link's in the show notes. Go ahead and scroll down. On that PDF is 100% equipment for your podcasting studio that I've personally vetted. My team has vetted this. We know that it works. We know that it's affordable, and we don't want you paying more for your podcasting equipment. So again, if you're looking to upgrade your equipment or get your very first inexpensive microphone that works great, That's where you go. And then number 2 is got a free course, A to Z, on everything you need to know about podcasting. And you don't have to go anywhere but the podcast in order to access it. You don't have to even give me an email address to access it. It is just the very first 6 episodes of this podcast. So what you'll do is you'll scroll down a bit. You'll click on all episodes and scroll down because we're hundreds of episodes in. And you'll see that episode 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 is a free course from A to Z on launching a top podcast. Take advantage of those 2 things. I'll see you on the next episode.